Imagine being told that your punishment will not be measured in minutes or hours, but in days, weeks, or even months of continuous agony, with every aspect of your torture carefully calculated to ensure that you remain alive and conscious throughout an ordeal so prolonged that you will lose track of time itself and begin to measure your existence not in days, but in degrees of suffering. What you're about to learn about isn't just a torture method, but a sophisticated system of prolonged human destruction that represents one of history's most horrifying applications of medical knowledge, engineering precision, and psychological manipulation to the problem of making death seem like an impossible dream, while transforming life into an endless nightmare. The ancient Chinese practice known as Ling Qi, or death by 1,000 cuts, was specifically designed to extend the dying process over periods that could last for days or weeks, turning execution into a form of living hell that challenged every assumption about the limits of human endurance and the relationship between pain and consciousness. The fundamental principle behind Ling Qi was the systematic removal of small pieces of flesh from the victim's body in a carefully predetermined sequence that would cause maximum pain while avoiding damage to vital organs that might cause premature death, representing ancient China's most sophisticated understanding of human anatomy applied to the problem of prolonged torture. The process would begin with the removal of fingernails and toenails, creating intense pain while demonstrating to the victim exactly what awaited the rest of their body. The torture would then progress to the systematic removal of small pieces of skin and muscle from non-vital areas, with each cut being precisely placed to cause maximum nerve stimulation while avoiding major blood vessels that might cause fatal bleeding. The most skilled practitioners could remove hundreds of individual pieces of flesh over a period of days or weeks, while keeping the victim conscious and aware throughout the entire process of their gradual dismantlement. The tools used for Ling Qi were specifically designed and crafted for precision cutting that would allow for the removal of exactly the right amount of tissue while preventing accidental damage that might interfere with the prolonged torture schedule. Master craftsmen would spend months creating specialized knives with different blade shapes and sizes for cutting different types of tissue, while the handles were designed to provide perfect control and prevent operator fatigue during extended cutting sessions. The cutting implements were kept razor-sharp through constant maintenance and were often heated to specific temperatures that would cauterize wounds and prevent excessive bleeding while adding thermal pain to the cutting trauma. Some practitioners used multiple sets of tools that could be heated to different temperatures, allowing them to vary the intensity of pain while ensuring that the cutting process could continue without interruption. The anatomical knowledge required to perform Ling Qi effectively reveals how ancient Chinese medicine had developed extraordinarily sophisticated understanding of human physiology that was then perverted to serve the goal of maximizing suffering rather than promoting healing. Practitioners had mapped out every nerve pathway in the human body and understood exactly which cuts would cause the most intense pain while avoiding damage to organs or blood vessels that were essential for maintaining life. They knew which areas of the body contained the highest concentrations of pain receptors and could target these regions for maximum effect while leaving other areas intact to ensure that the victim remained conscious and responsive. The knowledge of pressure points, circulation patterns, and organ placement that informed Ling Qi practice represented medical expertise that was centuries ahead of its time, but was dedicated entirely to causing prolonged human suffering. The psychological techniques employed during Ling Qi were as sophisticated as the physical cutting methods, with practitioners using carefully timed periods of cutting and rest to maximize the victim's psychological suffering while preventing mental escape mechanisms that might provide relief from their physical agony. The extended duration of the torture process created opportunities for elaborate psychological manipulation that could be more devastating than the physical pain itself. Victims would be forced to watch as their own bodies were systematically dismantled, while practitioners would explain exactly what was happening and describe in detail the cuts that were planned for future sessions. The anticipation of continued torture often proved more psychologically devastating than the immediate pain, as victims would spend hours or days between cutting sessions, contemplating their fate and knowing that their suffering had barely begun. The documentation and record-keeping associated with Ling Chi practice reveals how this ultimate torture method had become a form of administrative science, with detailed protocols, quality standards, and performance metrics that transformed human suffering into a bureaucratic process. Official manuals provided step-by-step instructions for every aspect of the torture, including diagrams showing optimal cutting patterns, timing schedules for different phases of the process, and guidelines for maintaining the victim's health between cutting sessions. Performance evaluations were conducted for practitioners, with successful torture sessions being measured by factors such as duration, victim consciousness levels, and the number of cuts that could be administered before death occurred. The bureaucratization of extreme torture made it appear legitimate and professional while providing institutional protection for practitioners who might otherwise have faced moral or legal challenges to their work. The scheduling and pacing of Ling Chi torture required sophisticated understanding of human endurance limits and recovery patterns that allowed practitioners to extend the process over maximum possible time periods while maintaining the victim's consciousness and responsiveness. The torture would typically be conducted in daily sessions lasting several hours, with rest periods between sessions that were carefully calculated to allow for partial healing and psychological recovery that would make the victim more sensitive to subsequent cutting. During rest periods, victims would receive basic medical care designed not to relieve their suffering, but to ensure that they remained alive and healthy enough for continued torture. Food and water were provided in precisely calculated amounts to maintain basic bodily functions while preventing the strength or energy that might allow resistance or escape attempts. The public spectacle aspects of extended Ling Chi executions transformed these multi-day torture events into elaborate social and political theater that could influence public opinion and demonstrate state power over periods that allowed for maximum psychological impact on spectators. Viewing stands would be constructed around execution sites to accommodate crowds that might gather for days or weeks to observe the gradual destruction of high-profile victims. The extended duration of the torture allowed for elaborate ceremonial elements, including daily speeches by officials who would explain the political and moral significance of what spectators were witnessing. Different phases of the torture process were often timed to coincide with specific political events or religious observances, maximizing the symbolic impact while ensuring that the victim's suffering served multiple propaganda purposes. The medical support systems developed to sustain victims during extended Ling Chi torture represent some of history's most sophisticated applications of healing knowledge to the goal of prolonging suffering rather than relieving it. Specialized physicians were employed to monitor the victim's condition throughout the torture process, using their medical expertise to ensure that cutting could continue without risking premature death from shock, infection, or blood loss. Medical interventions included techniques for treating wounds to prevent fatal complications while maintaining maximum pain sensitivity, methods for reviving unconscious victims who might miss portions of their torture, and procedures for managing the victim's overall health to ensure that the cutting process could continue for the maximum possible duration. The social and family impact of extended Ling Chi executions reveals how these prolonged torture events could terrorize entire communities while destroying the social relationships and support networks of everyone connected to the victim. Family members were often forced to witness their loved ones' gradual destruction over days or weeks, creating traumatic experiences that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The extended duration of the torture meant that entire communities would be focused on the victim's suffering for prolonged periods, disrupting normal social and economic activities while creating shared traumatic memories that could influence community behavior for generations. Some families would hold vigils during their relatives' torture, while others would flee the area entirely to avoid witnessing the prolonged suffering of someone they cared about. The economic costs of conducting extended Lingqi torture were enormous, requiring specialized personnel, medical support, security arrangements, and facility maintenance that made each torture event extraordinarily expensive to organize and execute. The costs included not just the practitioners and medical staff, but also guards, administrators, crowd control personnel, and support staff who were required to maintain the complex logistical arrangements necessary for multi-day torture events. Despite these costs, authorities considered the investment worthwhile because of the torture's effectiveness in terrorizing populations and demonstrating the consequences of challenging state authority. The economic impact extended beyond direct costs to include the disruption of normal commercial and social activities in communities where extended torture events were conducted. The international reputation of Lingqi torture made it a form of diplomatic weapon that could influence foreign relations and international behavior through the demonstration of willingness to inflict consequences so severe that they transcended normal concepts of political retaliation. Foreign visitors and diplomats were sometimes specifically invited to witness extended torture sessions, with the goal being to convince other nations that challenging Chinese interests would result in consequences that no rational government would be willing to risk. The reputation for extreme cruelty that developed around Chinese torture practices influenced international negotiations and trade relationships, while serving as a form of psychological deterrence that could affect foreign policy decisions without requiring actual military action. The technological innovations developed specifically to support extended torture sessions demonstrate how human ingenuity could be systematically applied to perfecting prolonged suffering while ensuring that victims remained alive and conscious throughout multi-day ordeals. Specialized restraint systems were designed to immobilize victims while allowing access to all parts of their bodies for cutting, while the restraints themselves were engineered to prevent circulation problems or pressure sores that might interfere with the torture schedule. Climate control systems were developed to maintain optimal temperature and humidity conditions that would maximize the victim's sensitivity to pain while preventing environmental factors from causing premature death or unconsciousness. The training and professional development programs for Lingqi practitioners created educational systems that treated prolonged torture as a legitimate skill, requiring years of study and practical experience to master effectively. Apprentice practitioners would spend months or years learning the anatomical knowledge necessary to perform extended cutting without causing accidental death, while they also studied the psychological techniques that would enhance the torture's effectiveness. Master practitioners were highly respected professionals who commanded substantial fees for their expertise and were sought after by authorities throughout China who wanted to ensure that their most important torture events were conducted with maximum skill and effectiveness. The record-keeping and documentation systems associated with extended Lingqi torture created extensive archives that provide disturbing insights into how systematic torture had become a form of institutional knowledge, with its own professional standards and quality control procedures. Detailed records were maintained of every torture session, including information about cutting techniques, victim responses, optimal timing patterns, and innovative approaches that could be applied to future cases. These records served as institutional memory that allowed the torture system to operate with increasing efficiency and effectiveness over time, while also providing legal documentation that could be used to justify the torture and demonstrate compliance with established procedures. The eventual abolition of lingqi came not through humanitarian reform, but through political modernization efforts that sought to improve China's international reputation and reduce the diplomatic costs associated with maintaining such extreme torture practices. The enormous resources required to conduct extended torture sessions had become increasingly difficult to justify as China developed more efficient methods of social control and law enforcement. While the international diplomatic consequences of maintaining such notorious torture capabilities began to outweigh their domestic deterrent benefits. The formal abolition of lingqi in 1905 marked the end of over 1,000 years of institutionalized prolonged torture, though the psychological and cultural impact of the practice continued to influence Chinese society for decades afterward. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of lingqi reveals the extraordinary human capacity for systematically prolonging suffering through the application of advanced knowledge and institutional resources to the problem of causing maximum pain while preventing death. The fact that entire professional communities could develop around perfecting multi-day torture while maintaining their sense of technical competence and social legitimacy demonstrates how completely institutional authority and cultural tradition can override basic human empathy when societies treat individual suffering as acceptable cost for achieving abstract goals. This historical example serves as a powerful warning about the potential for systematic cruelty to become normalized and professionalized when societies abandon moral constraints in favor of instrumental reasoning that prioritizes institutional objectives over human welfare and dignity. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how medical knowledge and professional expertise could be systematically applied to the problem of making torture last for days or weeks while preventing the mercy of death? Can you imagine the mindset of practitioners who would dedicate their careers to perfecting techniques for prolonging human suffering over extended periods while maintaining their sense of professional competence and social respectability? The fact that this represented legitimate institutional practice rather than individual sadism really makes you wonder about the capacity for systematic cruelty that exists within human societies when cultural traditions and institutional authority provide justification for extreme violence, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how this historical example might relate to contemporary institutions or practices that cause prolonged suffering while maintaining claims to legitimacy and professional standards. If you found this investigation into one of history's most sophisticated and prolonged torture methods as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how human knowledge and institutional power can be corrupted to serve systematic cruelty rather than human welfare. Ring that notification bell, because our next deep dive will explore another historical example of how professional expertise can be turned toward perfecting human suffering when societies prioritize abstract goals over individual dignity and rights. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between institutional authority and human compassion forever.